How did the church respond to and adapt to the conflict in Vietnam? We chose this topic because we are interested in how the church reacted to a time that was filled with war and havoc. It also interests us how the government who wanted to engage in war felt about the church's anti-war and nonviolence attitude. We have always learned about how the conflict in Vietnam is considered one of the deadliest wars, but have never looked into how it impacted the church. Because we knew that the church is anti-war, we wondered what types of movements the church started in hopes of decreasing conflicts in the future. This topic is significant to us because both of us had relatives that served in the war. My grandfather was a mechanic in the war, while Tim had a grandfather and a great-grandfather that were a part of the Coast Guard. In conclusion, we wanted to look into how the war put the Catholic Church against the government in terms of their beliefs. The Vietnam War included the Communist government of North Vietnam against South Vietnam, who was allied with the United States. Many opposed the war, which created conflict and a divide within the American people. A teacher at Angelo State University in Texas said that the church's anti-war activism turned people off, and that the horror of the war raised broader existential questions about the human condition and existence of a higher power. Some people questioned God, while others turned to God to help them get through. The Vietnam War, along with the United States' involvement, began in 1954, although the conflict between North and South Vietnam had been going on for decades. In April 1975, Saigon was captured, marking the end of the war, and the following year North and South Vietnam were unified again. Over the course of the war, more than 3 million people were killed, half of those people being Vietnamese civilians. The Vietnam War was the first war post-Vatican II in the Catholic Church. Two of the figures that the Catholic Church identifies as models of peace are Dorothy Day and the Berrigan brothers. Dorothy Day dedicated her life to the gospel and church, aiming to change people to create a more peaceful society. During a time of turmoil, Dorothy Day's nonviolent ways were able to encourage the rich to the poor to turn to God for guidance. Dorothy converted to Catholicism in 1927, and 6 years later she co-founded the Catholic Worker, a newspaper that promotes the Catholic teachings attempting to address issues of social justice. The Berrigan brothers consisted of older brother Daniel Berrigan and younger brother Philip Berrigan. Together, Daniel and Philip led the anti-war and anti-draft movement during the Vietnam War. Although the anti-war activism created an alienism between the brothers and the government, they continued to push the peaceful attitude in hopes of change. Overall, the Vietnam War did a lot of damage to the U.S. economy, putting about $168 billion into it. The war in Vietnam promoted a couple of policy changes. One of the main changes was to end the military draft and replace it with an army consisting of all volunteers, as well as change the voting age to 18. To this day, the Vietnam War still appears large in the minds of American leaders decades after the end of the war. The Vietnam Syndrome will continue to impact American foreign policy for years to come.
There was no collective response by any religious entities or by United States Catholics to the fast-paced and concerning rise of the conflict in Vietnam that took place in the 1960s. This can be seen repeating itself in history through the same lack of unified response to the more recent wars in Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, and Africa. In the mid 1960s, certain Christian organizations that vouched for peace, for example, the Catholic Worker Movement, and the clergy and laity concerned about Vietnam and the American Friends Service Committee. Catholic organizations like these spoke out against rising United States involvement in Vietnam. Public and mainstream groups like the U.S. Catholic Bishops' Conference and the National Association of Evangelicals had voices on this topic as well, firmly backing the pro-war policies of the current Commander-in-Chief, President Lyndon Johnson. A scholar who documented the religious response to the war by the name of Kenneth Heinemann stated that public media coverage of the extreme or undermining beliefs of certain religious leaders, such as left-wing Catholic priests Daniel and Philip Berrigan. These leaders, Heinemann said, hurt the overall brand of religion in America. The Church's anti-war position evidently turned many people away from the Catholic Church, a direct result of the nation being boldly divided in terms of contradicting opinion on the subject of war. Vietnam was the first post-Vatican II war and post-Passeum in Terrace war. Passeum in Terrace was a document written by Pope John the 23rd promoting the idea that peace between all peoples must be based on the core concepts of truth, justice, love, and freedom. Vatican II was a council of Catholic leaders that addressed the relationship between the Church and real-world issues. In today's world, there are no outstanding differences in the relationship between the Church and the morality of war and the Church and the military. The Vatican II document that relates to this is Gaudium et Spes. This document talks about the avoidance of war, Chapter 5, Section 1. Destruction of cities and land in general is a religious crime against the teachings of God as we are destroying His creation. This portion of Vatican II advocates for world unity, which in theory would end all war-based and violent international conflict. It also recognizes the dignity of all people and the well-being of all society. Another point this document touches on is the justification of war. If people find ways to qualify war as just, it will ultimately be the downfall of civilization and humanity. The most important thing that we learned was that the Catholic Church is not afraid to stand by its doctrine and teachings even in the midst of a world crisis. Something that surprised us was the clear divide and difference of opinion in our country because although there was a very serious and controversial conflict overseas, there was a conflict within our own borders. The Church and anti-war advocates versus the government and pro-war advocates. Something we would probably do differently if we were to do this research again is to research harder so that we would be able to find specific numbers and statistics about the Church during the time of the war so we could gain a more concrete view of how Catholicism was impacted by the war.